At ICMI20 in London, I gave a talk which illustrated some of the disadvantages to which men and boys are subject in the UK, including in criminal justice, education, healthcare, and several aspects of paternity rights. What I shall do in this talk is an update on some matters arising in the last 2 years. As usual, in just 45 minutes or so, it's a matter of which 1% or so of the possible topics to choose and which 99% to leave out. Anyway, firstly, education. I'll pass over the fiasco that was the allocation of grades to school qualifications this year, 2020. Let's look at university entry in the UK in 2019. Women need extra assistance in STEM subjects, right? Wrong. Men do dominate still in the T, the E and the first M of STEM, technology, engineering and maths, but women dominate in the S, the sciences, and the second M, medicine and subjects allied to medicine. In the sciences, the entrance numbers look like this. The dominance of women in the biological sciences continues to increase, now at an all-time high of 65% excess of women over men. This is far greater than men's dominance in the physical sciences, which is only 20% and reducing each year. Women have dominated over men in the sciences for decades, a simple fact which has yet to penetrate the crania of politicians, or so they pretend. There is now an excess of women in the sciences of 44%. The number of women studying medicine or dentistry has also exceeded the number of men for decades. In 2019, the excess of women over men starting courses in medicine or dentistry reached an all-time high of 68%. But even in STEM subjects as a whole, women dominate. Thus, sex parity in STEM, with 2 M's, was reached 5 years ago, and women's dominance is now 15% and continues to increase. In 2016, the Department for Education published an education policy document whose only reference to gender was, "We will continue to address the gender gap in STEM subjects, supporting our ambition to narrow the gender pay gap, and are committed to increasing the proportion of entries by girls in science and maths subjects." Increasing the proportion of entries by girls in science subjects, increase their dominance beyond the current 44%, that is. Is that policy driven by fact or policy driven by prejudice? If it isn't prejudice, it must be the most staggering ignorance by the Department for Education of the most basic educational data. As for other subjects, the broad picture is this. Women dominate in everything, apart from architecture with approximate parity in business studies. Veterinary or agricultural sciences, there are 3 times as many women as men and increasing. Law, more than twice as many women and increasing. Languages, more than 3 times as many women and increasing. Art and design, nearly twice as many women and increasing. Social sciences, 60% more women. Education, 6 times as many women. The big picture is this. In society at large, men are disadvantaged in educational attainment, healthcare, criminal justice, and the operation of the family courts. The corresponding academic disciplines are education, medicine, law, and social studies, in all of which women dominate by large amounts. Absolutely no possibility of systemic prejudice then. Let me anticipate those who insist that it's women's turn to dominate because men have been dominating in education for centuries. Well, if you are the sort of person that is concerned only about the wealthiest 1% of the population, then yes. Otherwise, no. In 1920, 100 years ago, just 3,145 men and 1,212 women were awarded degrees in the UK, so 28% to women. But the salient fact is that the participation rate, that is, the number of degrees awarded as a proportion of the population aged 21, was only half of 1%. When more than 90% of the populace were working class, the more indicative fact is shown by this graph. It shows the percentage of girls and boys who were educated only to primary school level, that is, to about age 11. It's an average over OECD countries, so developed countries only. Girls on the blue line and boys the black dashed line. In 1900, 81% of boys and 85% of girls were educated only to primary school level. The dominant feature of the graph is hardly the difference between the sexes, which is relatively slight. The dominant feature is that 120 years ago, more than 80% of both sexes, essentially the working class, were educated only to primary school level. Apart from the elites, equality was the norm. Equality of having little, that is. Recall that when Christabel Pankhurst was campaigning for the vote for women, and later when she addressed recruiting rallies to send men to the front in World War I, she had a degree. In contrast, not only did more than half the men she addressed at recruiting rallies not have the vote any more than she did, but around 80% of them had not been educated beyond primary school level. There's something slightly awry with the popular narrative, is there not? Nor is this really ancient history. My own parents, who were at school in the late 20s and early 30s, were educated only to age 13, and this applied to both of them. Here's a question for you. Over the whole of history, which sex has been awarded more degrees in the UK? I make it about parity, which means over the next year or two, the answer will be women. Turning now to healthcare. The big picture on health is that men are 78% more likely than women to die before the age of 45. The leading cause of death in men under 45 is suicide. Men remain 50% more likely to die than women until they are well past retirement age. By far the most significant causes of men's premature deaths, that is before the age of 75, are cardiovascular diseases and cancers. There has been one positive on healthcare since ICMI20. The HPV vaccination was rolled out to boys at age 12 or 13 by the NHS last September. Recall that HPV is the prime cause of cervical cancer in women and the prime cause of oropharyngeal cancers in men, and that the mortality burden due to HPV cancers is about the same in the two sexes. But girls got the vaccination 11 years earlier, and it took many years of campaigning by a host of medical bodies, and ultimately the spectre of legal action, to get the vaccination for boys at all. Let's be grateful for a success on this issue. However, the government has refused to provide a catch-up vaccination programme, which means that we can anticipate the raised incidence of oropharyngeal cancers in men persisting for 11 years longer than it might have done. The obvious health issue recently has, of course, been COVID-19. Don't worry, I'm not going to bang on much about that. We've all had enough of it. But it has provided yet another fine illustration of the empathy gap in practice. I've lost track of the number of online discussions, generally many hours long, involving Parliament's Women and Equalities Committee or the Equality and Human Rights Commission, or professors of gerontology and many, many others, endlessly repeating how COVID-19 has affected women most. On the scoreboard of victimhood, dying would seem not to rate highly, not if the dead are men, anyway. I await rigorous multivariate regressions being done, but it's fairly clear that men have about double the probability of dying from COVID-19. The usual feminist culprits have had an excellent opportunity to display their sexist bigotry, publishing articles asserting things like, I quote, "There's plenty of evidence that men aren't so bothered about hand washing and general cleanliness," without citation, obviously. I don't know about viruses, but the evidence regarding bacteria on hands is not that. Here are the results of some published bacteria assays from hand swabs. Graphs on the screen now are from Noah Fiera et al. 2008. They show that the range of different types of bacteria tends to be larger on women's hands than on men's hands. And another study is the 2010 paper by Judah et al., who took hand swabs from members of the public using public transport. Data was gathered at 5 major cities in the UK and concentrated upon bacteria of fecal origin. Data from 3 cities indicated that a greater percentage of women than men had contaminated hands. Data from 2 cities indicated that a greater percentage of men than women had contaminated hands. Overall, there was no significant difference. Turning now to criminal justice. The appalling bias in criminal justice is something I've addressed in detail many times. Let me allude very briefly to the big picture of our gendered criminal justice in the UK. But then I want to do something a little different and look at the incarceration not of adult men, but of boys worldwide. Here are some key principles of justice. 1. Everyone is equal before the law, irrespective of race, creed, or sex. 2. Everyone has the right to be regarded as innocent until proven guilty. 3. Everyone has a right to expect all available evidence and testimony to be brought before the court. 4. Everyone accused of an indictable criminal offence and pleading not guilty has the right to be judged by his or her peers, the right to a trial by jury. It is a national disgrace and the most staggering indictment of our society that these fundamental principles of justice are all under threat. The first has been explicitly overturned as policy. The second has de facto been undermined in sexual assault cases. The third often fails in practice, and the last is under threat from those with an extreme partisan agenda. To amplify these points, equality before the law has palpably been untrue essentially forever, as men are systematically subject to harsher penalties for the same offence as women, even when the offending history is also the same. But since 2018, this has actually been declared as government policy. The policy is to avoid sending women to prison wherever possible. The programme to build new women's prisons to replace old ones which have been closed has been axed, in place of community centres with shared accommodation and including children. For men, prison sentences continue to get longer and more prisons are being built. It has become notorious that men accused of sexual assault are effectively required to prove their innocence. As if proving a negative was not difficult enough, the rash of failed prosecutions at the end of 2017 and early 2018 led to public outcry regarding the widespread failure of the disclosure process. Key exculpatory evidence was simply not being put before the court, either because the police had not bothered to search for it, or, worse, because they failed to disclose it despite being in possession of it. I'm going to read a long quote from what solicitor Matthew Graham wrote in January 2018, because it is especially revealing given that it comes, as it were, from within the system. This isn't a story of a few rogue cops gone bad, or a crumbling, underfunded criminal justice system overwhelmed by national austerity, though both get blamed daily in courts and the press to cover a wider, more difficult truth. This is a story of a state-funded system designed with political ends in mind to convict those accused of crime, because once a person is charged, they must be guilty, if only the Crown can prove it. The job of the police is to investigate whether and by whom an offence has been committed. They have a legal duty to investigate all reasonable lines of inquiry, whether they point towards the guilt or the innocence of a particular suspect. It sounds simple, but if you are a suspect in a criminal case, you need to understand that this is not how it works. Inconvenient evidence that would undermine a prosecution or assist a suspect doesn't achieve either of those aims, so it doesn't have any real importance. As soon as the police think their job is to catch the criminals, the system goes wrong, because it is they, not a court or a jury or anyone independent, who is deciding on who is a criminal and then setting about proving it. Pity those, and there are many, who didn't get the disclosure they deserved. Pity those suspects where the police hold or could hold evidence that helps their case that they don't know about. An extra witness here, a useful 999 call there, social services records, school reports, text messages, emails and social media content, and ever on. And more fool those who expect a court to help their quest for fair disclosure. Expect to be met with apathy at best, more likely positive resistance. Expect to be told you're simply fishing for a loophole. Expect to have to justify the relevance of material you have never seen. Expect the court to wholly accept the bland assurance of a prosecutor in court that never comes to fruition. Expect excuse after excuse after excuse, and expect no one in authority to care one bit. And when you reach the day of trial without having received what the law says you should, expect the trial to carry on all the same, because this is what happens in cases every day all over the country in magistrates and crown courts. End quote. The feminist lobby, with their single-minded determination to imprison more men for rape, have spotted that juries have a habit of frustrating this objective by having the temerity to find men not guilty. With admirable feminist logic, the solution is to do away with juries in rape trials. It's rather disconcerting when you get members of Parliament like Anne Coffey proposing just that. The public concern over cases like Liam Allen's and several others in 2018 led to Alison Saunders being replaced as Director of Public Prosecutions. The result was a CPS which, for the last 2 years, has been prosecuting a smaller proportion of cases referred to it by the police, reversing the previous policy of prosecuting even weak cases with too low a likelihood of gaining conviction. Some of which, like the infamous Mark Pearson case, not so much weak as entirely non-existent. But making progress against the feminist state is like brushing water uphill. Inevitably, it comes right back again. The public's memory and hence concern rapidly evaporates. Having given it a couple of years, the feminists are on the march again, demanding that more men are sent to prison. Enter Vera Baird, committed feminist, one-time Solicitor General, one-time Police and Crime Commissioner of Northumbria, and now the Victims Commissioner. She has suggested to ministers that they take rape prosecution decisions out of the hands of the CPS. The Prime Minister has all but acceded to Baird's demands. He has promised that the cross-government Crime and Justice Task Force, which he leads, will impose targets on the police to refer more high-quality rape cases. He has also promised to impose targets on the CPS to prosecute both a greater volume of cases and a greater proportion of cases. Absolutely no political interference in the justice process there then. What is a high-quality rape case? Well, it's one with a high probability of gaining conviction. And how exactly are the police supposed to improve the quality of rape cases? In other words, to improve the chances of conviction. Well, that's simple. They try hard to build a prosecution case, but they put no effort into finding exculpatory evidence. In other words, they revert to the negligent practices which led to the debacles of the recent past, disclosure failures. And whilst this is strictly a police failure, one sees clearly now how the political system pushes the police in that direction. In this instance, by a Prime Minister with insufficient wisdom or awareness or the balls to stand up to the feminist lobby. In that respect, he differs from the rest of Parliament not one bit. I said I'd address the worldwide issue of children in custody. We know that adult men are treated far more harshly in the criminal justice system throughout the developed world, not just the UK. Less is said about incarceration of juveniles. In my ICMI20 talk, I alluded to the gender ratio of children in custody in the UK, 97% boys, and that the Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, out of concern for the plight of such children, had visited 10 of them, but that, despite the overwhelming preponderance of boys, she had visited only girls, who account for just 3% of those in custody. In 2019, the UN published a report on children in custody worldwide. Not noted for their egalitarian stance towards males, this particular UN report is a remarkable exception, aided perhaps by the fact that many of the boys in question are non-white. The report identifies 7 million children in various types of custody, including police cells, prison and detention centres. 94% of them are boys worldwide. The UN Secretary General himself wrote that it is, quote, above all boys who are largely overrepresented in detention and throughout judicial proceedings. He further noted that deprivation of liberty continues a form of structural violence against children. In view of the latter observation and the overwhelming preponderance of boys in custody, is it not reasonable to conclude that the UN Secretary General has identified an instance of gendered structural violence against boys? Oddly, that famous document which is so concerned over systemic gendered violence, the Istanbul Convention, makes no mention of it. The Secretary General observes, while approximately 1/3 of all criminal offences worldwide committed by children are attributed to girls, only 6% receive a prison sentence. Those words are best explained by this graphic from the report. We hear feminists complain about leaky pipelines in the context of women gaining senior employment positions. We don't hear so much about the leaky pipeline illustrated in this graphic. It is uncannily similar to the progress of adults through the UK criminal justice system, in which women are about 27% of those convicted, but only 5% of those imprisoned. The section in the report on discrimination against boys puts England and Wales amongst the top few countries in terms of gender ratio. Quote, in some states, the percentage of boys detained in the context of the administration of justice is close to 98%, brackets, England and Wales and Argentina, or even 99%, South Africa and Georgia. I must ask, did we want to be in such company? Almost all you need to know is the title of one of the UN report's subsections. The penal system is the most gendered institution in society. Yes, quite. What follows in that section is something I never thought to see in a report from the UN. Quote, most research on the gender dimension of deprivation of liberty primarily addresses cases of discrimination against girls, not against boys. According to research conducted by Bruce Abramson, the penal system, adult and juvenile, is the most heavily gendered institution in society, even more so than the military, given current trends. He adds that the human rights movement and the children's rights movement in particular are contributing to this male-female gender gap by discriminating against boys. The UN report continues with this quote from an external source. Some adults are in deep denial of the gender issue when boys are at the losing end of the disparities. But most people recognise that there is a gender issue. Sad to say, there is outright sex discrimination against boys in the CRC movement. CRC being the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. In other words, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, they have identified in a UN report as being the basis by which there is discrimination against boys. Remarkable. The important thing which is being acknowledged here is that this is not simply about boys being more criminal. The graphic tells us that, and again I quote, 35% to 40% of all criminal offences worldwide are attributed to girls. However, only 1/4 of all children, 25%, who come in formal contact with the criminal justice system are girls. Finally, only 11.6% of all convicted children are girls, and only 6% of all children who end up in detention are girls. This is harsher treatment based simply on being male, just as it is for adults in the UK and elsewhere. But it is children, boys, we are talking about now and worldwide. Turning now to fathers' issues and domestic abuse. I must address fathers' issues and domestic abuse, though I don't relish the prospect. There has been a huge amount of activity in this area in the last year or two. Do notice how lumping fathers' issues and domestic abuse together as one category now seems so natural. Reset your mind. It isn't natural at all. This elision has been engineered, and what a wicked conflation it is. The chief recruiting sergeant for the MGTOW community must surely be the UK Parliament, unless it's the devolved parliaments instead. They are determined to make marriage and children so massively disadvantageous to men that young men must surely stop obliging at some point. They are determined to make intimate relations with women so hazardous that men stop bothering with that too. They achieve these noble ends by the implacable application of systematic prejudice. That the Divorce Act, which was passed this year, was less egregious than the other events serves only to emphasise how appalling were those other events, which I will come to. The Divorce Act makes no-fault divorce official, though it has been a fact in all but name for a long time. What the Act really does is to make divorce unilateral. Only one party need apply. She or he will have to wait 26 weeks before the divorce is finalised, but the process is automatic and cannot be contested. Indeed, the other party need not even know that the process is underway until 6 weeks before he or she finally finds themselves single. Marriage is now meaningless. Unfortunately, marriage is the only means by which a man can guarantee to be granted parental responsibility for his children. The Act is another hammer blow to fatherhood, and as such, condemns our society to further decline. This unilateral divorce bill received little public attention. In particular, our journalistic class did not bother to inform us just how unpopular the provisions of the bill were known to be with the public. The willingness of our esteemed parliamentarians to ignore the declared wishes of the electorate was unambiguously demonstrated last year in the Brexit saga. The passage of this bill was another example of how we deplorables can be ignored. After all, the people who know best are the people who know best, and that's not you. This is what Baroness Eaton said during the second reading of the bill in the Lords. I am concerned by the way in which the government appear to have dealt with the consultation process that preceded the bill. Consultations are intended to ensure that the government have listened to the public and adjusted their proposals in the light of the concerns expressed. In the consultation on divorce reform, 80%, that's 80% of those who responded did not agree with the proposal to replace the 5 facts demonstrating that a marriage had irretrievably broken down with a notification process. A mere 17% were in favour of the proposed change. Furthermore, 83% of those who responded disagreed with the government's proposal to remove the ability of a spouse who does not want the divorce, who wishes to contest the assertion that their marriage has irretrievably broken down, while only 15% supported the plans. Can the minister please explain how much of the consultation was taken into consideration? Because this appears to conflict with the process that the government are taking forward. I have serious concerns that the bill will have negative consequences for families, end quote. Baroness Eaton was not the only person to make this point in the Lords. It made no difference. Parliament is the body that put the con into consultation, as we shall see again shortly. As I write, the Domestic Abuse Bill has completed its passage through the House of Commons and is starting its passage through the House of Lords. Quite likely, it will have become an act by the time this video appears. In parallel with the Domestic Abuse Bill progressing through the Commons, the Ministry of Justice saw fit to commission a family justice review on essentially the same subject. Both the bill and the Family Justice Review are examples of the most outrageous prejudice, spearheaded by the feminist lobby and facilitated by a government part complicit and part craven. Time is too short to address much within the bill. Many of us made submissions to the Public Bill Committee, but the witnesses who were invited to talk to the committee were 100% feminist organisations or female victims. The 1 in 3 male victims of domestic abuse, which the government's own ONS has identified for decades, were deliberately silenced for ideological reasons and because they can get away with it. The bill creates a new domestic abuse commissioner with frightening supra-governmental powers to require local authorities to do her bidding and powers to compel ministerial departments to explain their failures to carry out her recommendations. Here's just one provision of the bill: the creation of a new domestic abuse protection notice. This can be served on a man by a police officer of an inspector rank. This is quite a coup for the feminists, as the previous protection notices required authorization at superintendent level and hence were not widely used. We anticipate that the DAPNs, as we will lovingly call them, will be far more widely used. This serves as a mechanism for immediate ejection of a man from his home. If he later receives a call on his mobile from his partner and he picks up, he will have broken the terms of the protection notice. He will then be liable to immediate arrest without warrant. The local magistrates' court must consider granting a protection order and can do so in the absence of the man in question if he has been so remiss as to leave no address, which is quite likely now that the system itself has made him homeless. Moreover, if the court chooses to adjourn, the man can be held in custody on remand for 3 weeks. Pinch yourself. The most heinous thing that this incarcerated man may have done is to answer a phone call. Rejoice in our justice system. He is just another father on his way to being removed from the lives of his children because the system allows and indeed encourages a tale of his abusive nature to be spun out of thin air. You might be next. But there's worse on the horizon. The Family Justice Review was also about domestic abuse, specifically how such allegations are handled by the family courts. 50% of child arrangement cases in the family courts involve allegations of domestic abuse. This percentage is likely to increase further when the new DAPNs start being used. In principle, the courts are legally obliged to recognise that the continuing involvement of a parent in the life of his child is beneficial to the child, and hence that the paramountcy principle is in favour of ongoing involvement of the ejected father. Specifically, para 11(2)A of the Children and Families Act 2014 states that a court is to presume, quote, unless the contrary is shown, that involvement of that parent in the life of the child concerned will further the child's welfare. Enter the Ministry of Justice's Family Justice Review. What a fine display of blatant prejudice that was. The academic and professional representation on the panel which performed the so-called review was entirely feminist. Many organisations representing fathers objected, not least the Welsh charity of which I am trustee. We offered to fulfil the dual role of representing men and representing Wales. The response by the MOJ was to draft onto the panel Welsh Women's Aid and the Development Director of Respect. As a representative of male victims, Respect is like choosing the Berkshire Hunt to represent foxes. The only other man on the otherwise all-woman panel and all-woman report authors was Mr. Justice Cobb, a judge with a long list of previous as regards delivering unto the feminists whatever they currently demand. The authors of the main report were Professor Rosemary Hunter, Professor Mandy Burton, and Professor Liz Trinder. The author of the accompanying literature review was Dr. Adrienne Barnett. With such authors, you know what you are going to get before it's due. Hunter and Trinder have a long history of feminist advocacy. Both were involved in the infamous Norgrove report, which successfully misrepresented the research literature to the Ministry of Justice and persuaded them to declare against shared parenting. Trinder being quoted in the report as stating, "I am encouraged that the review has opted against a shared care presumption that is entirely consistent with the research evidence on what works for children." Except it isn't. It blows one's mind that the MOJ think that Adrienne Barnett is a suitable person to carry out empirical research actually on anything, given her openly expressed view that scientific research is just a patriarchal contrick to abuse women. Here is a quote from Barnett's 2014 PhD thesis. This study concludes that in order to regain a valid and authoritative voice for women in current family law, we need to expose and disrupt law's construction of the scientific truth about children's welfare. Are you happy with disrupting scientific truth, especially as it impacts children's welfare? Are you happy that scientific truth appears in scare quotes and is being called a construction? That quote is genuinely representative of Barnett's thesis, which is full of such stuff. Here's another quote. These perspectives recognize that data, like meaning, are constructed, not discovered, and reject the purely positivist notion of scientific objectivity, including the privileging of scientific research, which has been criticised for perpetuating patriarchal power relations and silencing women's voices. The Family Justice Review is a festival of prejudice plastered over with the pseudo-intellectual posturing which emanates from a mindset so well exposed by Barnett herself. Let me give you an example of the dishonesty of Barnett's literature review. The literature review suggests that the reporting of high levels of male victimisation by domestic abuse in the crime surveys for England and Wales may be due to those surveys not measuring coercive control. In support of that contention, the review quotes 2018 research by the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, thus. Research suggests that when coercive and controlling behaviour is taken into account, the differences between the experiences of male and female victims becomes more apparent. Barnett gives the impression that that was the outcome of the ONS's research, or at least their opinion. But actually, that statement was merely what the ONS's Domestic Abuse Statistics Steering Group expected to find before the ONS conducted its research. But what the ONS research actually concluded was, I quote, "Our findings are not consistent with this expectation." Let me digress for a moment. The creation of coercive control as a crime in 2016 was a move by the feminists to counter the increasing difficulty of hiding the statistics on violent domestic abuse, which shows men to be at least 33% of victims and by some measures more than 50%. The strategy demands being able to manipulate the definition of coercive control to skew its diagnosis to female victims. In truth, women can be extremely controlling. I hope I haven't given away any state secrets in making that observation. In a 2018 survey of male victims of domestic abuse, it indicated that nearly 90% of male victims had experienced coercive controlling behaviours from their female partners. More than 50% had experienced at least 6 different coercive controlling behaviours. But the feminist tactic is to big up fear as a defining characteristic of coercive control, thus skewing the diagnosis in favour of women, whilst resisting inclusion of child contact denial or false allegations in the definition. You see how that works. As always, they are massively assisted by our gynocentric culture and gynocentric judiciary. As a result, we find that coercive control is being used successfully as a weapon against men, whilst guilty women are getting away with it as ever. In 2018, in England and Wales, 499 men were tried for a principal charge of coercive control in an intimate relationship, compared with just 10 women. 305 men were convicted, compared with just 1 woman. 202 men went to prison. The 1 woman who was found guilty was given a community sentence. Returning to the Family Justice Review, the output from the review totals well over 400 pages, so I cannot go too deeply into it. But there's one key bit from the implementation plan. It announces the intention to undermine the above quote from the Children and Families Act 2014, which recognised that parental involvement in a child's life is beneficial. Quote, "Under the leadership of the Family Justice Board, we will review the presumption of parental involvement, which applies in certain private law children's proceedings, and which requires the court to presume that the involvement of each parent furthers the child's welfare, unless the involvement of that parent would put the child at risk of suffering harm." With the Family Justice Board in charge, what could possibly go wrong? It remains to be seen whether the Ministry of Justice will be allowed to get away with overturning primary legislation, which would be unconstitutional, or perhaps whether further primary legislation will ultimately result. However, the prognosis for fatherhood is looking ever bleaker. The prognosis must be that marriage will continue to decline and birth rates will continue to fall as increasing numbers of young men regard fatherhood as too great a risk to take. Any culture which fails to provide sufficient social support for fatherhood will decline and ultimately disappear.